this opinion to the public were that it would do great potential harm to science and international harmony, and do unnecessary harm to science in general and science in China in particular, even though their paychecks are funded by the American taxpayers. At the same time this was going on, the CCP was using its full weight and power to spread a propaganda campaign to conceal the origins of COVID, numbers of cases and deaths, and protect their own reputations while stockpiling medical supplies, severely hurting the global supply chain and definitely hurting America. In the same way, the CCP silenced, censored, and imprisoned dissenters who tried to tell the truth. Dr. Fauci and his cohorts seemingly were running their own misinformation and ultimately censorship campaign to, in quotes from Dr. Collins to Dr. Fauci, put down this very destructive conspiracy about the lab leak theory. But it's really interesting. I think we should revisit January 27th, 2020. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, finds out that they have a financial relationship with the Wuhan Institute of Virology through EcoHealth Alliance, and that they've been working with novel coronaviruses. January 31st, 2020, Dr. Fauci is warned by Dr. Christian Andersen that some of COVID-19's features potentially look engineered, and the genome is inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. Dr. Redfield, did you agree, in your opinion, with Dr. Andersen's assessment at the time that this virus did look engineered?
I was concerned because of the presence of the furin cleavage site that we've talked about. And I think it's important to understand what that cleavage site does. That cleavage site totally changes the orientation of the binding domain of COVID. So it now, which could not see the ACE2 receptor, which is the human receptor, it totally changes the orientation now, so it has high affinity for a human receptor. So that furin cleavage site bothered me. It didn't seem that it belonged there. And then when you look at the sequences that it used, and it's beyond the committee, but I know many of you have looked into it, the sequences that they used in those 12 nucleotides for arginine were the arginine sequences, nucleotide triplet, that coded for the human arginine. So why did this virus have the arginine sequences for human there, not bat? It was very disconcerting to me. It looked like this virus was engineered.
Was this, what you're observing and speaking of, is this something that would be in line with gain-of-function research and the capabilities it would provide to the virus?
Yeah, I mean, basically this lab published in 2014 that they accomplished in this, allowing the coronaviruses that they were working with in the lab to bind to the ACE2 receptor in humanized mice. And the only way they did that was by reorienting the binding domain.
And it was clear to them at this time that that was likely the issue in their private conversations. Yet by February 4th, a paper on the origins of COVID is drafted by 4 participants of the February 1 conference call. One of those participants, Dr. Andersen, completely reverses himself in an email to the president of EcoHealth, Peter Daszak, and says the main crackpot theories going around at the moment relate to this virus being somehow engineered, and that is demonstrably false. My question to you, Mr. Redfield, did you know of any evidence that they had found within 3 days from February 1st to February 4th to be able to confirm that it was not created in a lab?
As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, I was excluded from those conversations, which I found retroactively very disappointed, since I was obviously a virologist and very engaged, and I actually had asked Jeremy Farrar, Tony Fauci, and Tedros to have these conversations. And then to be excluded, I found unusual. I do think it illustrates one point that's worth really focusing on. When you have a group of people that decide there could only be one point of view, that's problematic. And I'll keep going saying it's antithetical to science, and unfortunately that's what they did.
I can tell you, Dr. Redfield, that is the case. It's very problematic because how people suffered in this country from those, what I would call tyrannical decisions using their positions of power and shutting down the country in the way they did. I think people definitely do feel that way. Thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize Dr. Jackson from Texas for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. Dr. Redfield, I want to thank you in particular for your service as CDC director. You were key in getting some of the meatpacking plants back up and running during the height of the pandemic in my district, and I appreciate that. I just want to say I agree with a few of the things that have been said on the other side of the aisle from my colleagues. And one of the things I want to talk about that hasn't really been addressed here from this side of the aisle is that, yes, I do believe that public health has been devastated by this COVID pandemic. But that is because public health officials in this country decided that they were going to consider the politics surrounding this issue when making statements and recommendations. That's the root of the problem with the public health here. And yes, this must be repaired. We have to get our public health industry back. The only way that that will change, is if we can regain the trust and confidence that we have to have in this country in our public health sector, is to look back. Look back at what happened, who made what decisions, and why those decisions were made. And most importantly, if public health authorities such as Anthony Fauci betrayed the trust of the American people, they must be held accountable. Period. Somebody has to be held accountable. This is a problem we have in government, throughout government. If there's no accountability, nothing changes. We're going to be doomed to repeat this whole disastrous period in American history again if we don't get the answers about what happened and why it happened. In addition, I just want to say that this continues to this very day. The WHO, China, the mainstream media, social media, they all need to be called out. They need to be held accountable for their part in this cover-up. Millions of people died, and we need some answers to what's going on. And I'll say that we still have an issue with this today. We still have an issue with corrupt, politically driven advice, and this is evidenced by the misinformation regarding masks, natural immunity, the need for boosters, and most importantly, and most important to me at this particular time, the inappropriate efforts to vaccinate our children. So I would just say that we have to regain this trust in public health, and we have to do it quickly before something like this comes down the pike again, because American people right now have zero trust and confidence in the public health sector in this country. So I want to ask you real quickly, Dr. Metzl and Dr. Redfield, what do you think that we should and could do to regain that trust of our public health sector?
A number of things. First, we need to look objectively, honest, directly, fearlessly at the COVID origins issue. As I've said before, I think the primary culprit, if that's the right word, is China. But we also need to look at ourselves. We really need to look at everything. We need to follow the evidence. We also need to establish a bipartisan process for evaluating the entirety of our readiness, and that's why in my remarks I recommended establishing a bipartisan COVID-19 commission, kind of like built on the model of the 9/11 commission, because it's going to be very difficult to do it piecemeal. We really need comprehensively, in a bipartisan manner to develop an action plan. And because health is international, that means exactly as you've said, we need to focus on the national and the international levels.
Dr. Redfield, real quickly.
Yeah, real quick. I think the first and foremost is we've got to tell the truth. When you don't tell the truth, you've got a problem. And I think if you go back, there were many times when public health officials packaged the message to what they wanted to say, but it wasn't necessarily truthful. The second thing, you have to have the courage when you're a public health official to say, I don't know, when you don't know. And I think that really fundamental, that's how we begin to lose it. When people say that we're going to be okay once we get 30% immunity, and then later they say 50%, and then later they say 70%, and then the press says, well, why did you say 50% before, and now you're saying 70%, and the guy says, well, I didn't think the public was ready to hear that.
Thank you,
You've
sir.
got to tell the truth.
I want to get a little bit of time here. I want to say how I said I did agree with some of the stuff that was being said on the opposite side of the aisle. One of the things I don't agree with, and I think that the way we have to fix this is we do have to get past the politics now. That it's over and it's done with. There's been a lot of damage done. We got to get past that. And I'm disturbed that the people on the left in this committee can't talk about this at all without bringing up Trump, racism, or conspiracy theorists. And I just want to clear the record on one particular thing. President Trump on May 29th, 2020, recognizing the failure leaders of WHO severed the U.S. relationship with WHO, citing the need for serious reforms. And despite no reforms taking place, on his first day in office, President Biden rejoined the WHO, which was and continues to be nothing more than a puppet of the Chinese government. I want to also say that on January 31st, 2020, President Trump came under intense criticism when he banned travel from China, an order then presidential candidate Biden called xenophobic, a move that even the highly respected Dr. Fauci on the other side of the aisle praised as saying that Trump's actions saved thousands and millions of lives. So thank you. With that, I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Jordan from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Look forward, the Democrats tell us. Focus on the future. Might have started in a lab, might have happened in nature. But here's the question I keep coming up with. If it may have been a lab, may have been nature, we're supposed to look forward, then why did Dr. Fauci work so hard for just one of those theories? Why was it so important to push one over the other? Dr. Barrett said, we should entertain all hypotheses. Dr. Fauci had his hypothesis, how this started. We should entertain all of them. But that's not what happened. That is definitely not what happened. 3 years ago, if you thought it came from a lab, if you raised that, you were called a nut job. You got censored on Twitter. You were blacklisted on Twitter. You were even called a crackpot by the very scientist who in late January sent emails to Dr. Fauci and said it came from a lab. They called you crackpot. Is that right, Dr. Redfield?
I think the most upsetting thing to me was the Baltimore Sun calling me a racist because I said this came from a Wuhan lab.
Dr. Redfield, you ran the CDC and you were on the coronavirus task force. Is that right?
Correct.
That was formed on January 29th, 2020. Is that right?
Correct.
2 days later, Dr. Fauci gets an email from Dr. Anderson which says what? Virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory. Is that accurate?
That's my understanding.
Next day, I know. Did he share that email with you, by the way, Dr. Redfield?
No.
As a member of the task force, as the head of CDC, did he share that email with you?
No.
Okay. Next day, February 1st, Dr. Gary sends Dr. Fauci another email. That email says, I don't know how this happens in nature, but it would be easy to do in a lab. Did he share that email with you, Dr. Redfield?
No.
You didn't see either one of those emails, even though you're head of CDC, even though you're on the coronavirus task force that had been formed just 3 days earlier.
No.
3 days later, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, who told us it came from a lab in emails to Dr. Fauci that Dr. Fauci wouldn't let Dr. Redfield see, 3 days later, they changed their position 180 degrees. The question is why? Mr. Wade, why would they change their position that fast when the only intervening event is a conference call with Dr. Fauci, the guy who wouldn't let Dr. Redfield see the very emails that they had sent him, Dr. Redfield, head of CDC on the coronavirus task force? Why would they change their position, Dr. Wade, or Mr. Wade?
Well, this question does lie at the heart of the issue. What is pertinent, it seems to me, is there's no new scientific evidence that we can see that became available between these dates, the January 31st and Feb 4.
Right. There's no new. I think you're. Go ahead.
So you have to ask if there were other kinds of influence available. Now, it is true that Dr. Fauci and Dr. Farry in London were very powerful research officials, and between them they controlled...
I read your testimony. I saw that. Yeah.
So...
Why don't you cut to the chase and tell them what you really think was the reason?
I don't know what the reason was.
I know what it was.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll let you say it because I read your testimony. I think you said it in your testimony too. Maybe you're reluctant to say it here, but go ahead.
Well, if you're looking at the timeline, on May 21st, just a few weeks after the Nature Medicine article had come out, two of the signatories of the original email to Dr. Fauci, that's Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, were awarded a $9 million grant for the...
So there's 9 million reasons why they changed their mind. I knew you'd get to it. I read that last night. 3 months after, so 3 days after they say it came from a lab, they changed their position, and the only intervening event's a conference call with Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins. Again, a call that Mr. Redfield was not allowed to be on, the head of CDC and on the coronavirus task force. And then 3 months later, shazam, they get $9 million from Dr. Fauci. Well, isn't that something? Isn't that something? That's why we want to talk to these guys. That's why Chairman Winstrup wants to bring in Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary and ask them a series of questions so we can get to the bottom of this. so we can move forward and deal with this. Now, here's the key question. Look, I'm just a common sense guy from Ohio. I majored in wrestling in college, but I got a degree in economics. You're supposed to get a degree when you go to college. I got one in economics. And one of the things they tell you about is a thing called opportunity cost. So when you're spending your time making sure that the country believes only one of these theories, you could have been doing what Dr. Redfield was doing in our government, trying to figure out how we deal with this virus. And what was Dr. Fauci doing? He was trying to cover his backside, and everybody knows it. And that's the part that ticks us off, because this is the highest paid guy in our government getting all kinds of money to tell us things that were not accurate. Because we now know U.S. tax dollars went to a lab in China, a lab that was not up to code, a lab that was doing gain-of-function research, and that's where this thing most definitely came from. And Dr. Fauci had to prove, no, he can't have that news getting out. And that's why he did what he did, to the exclusion of a brilliant guy running our CDC, kept him out of the loop. Keeping him out of the loop probably potentially could have harmed America. That's the thing that ticks us all off. And that's why, Mr. Chairman, this hearing is so darn important, and we get to the bottom of really what happened.